Questions orales, oral questions. The honourable member for Portage, Lisgar.
While the Prime Minister and his choice cabinet ministers are busy partying up in D.C. with family, lobbyists, and big Liberal donors, we're seeing a job crisis in Western Canada. The Prime Minister seems too busy trying to get a pat on the head from President Obama and his anti-oil activists to bother standing up for Canadian jobs. Why is the Prime Minister using this state visit as an opportunity to shine in the limelight and give special access to his lobbyist friends and their clients instead of standing up for Canadian interests?
The Honourable President of the Treasury Board.
Mr. Speaker, former Conservative Prime Minister Brian Mulroney said that the most important foreign policy priority for a Canadian Prime Minister is to have a personal relationship with the President of the United States. Mr. Speaker, this is a great week for Canada-U.S. relations. The previous Conservative Prime Minister didn't understand the importance of building those types of relationships, and he failed to defend Canada's interests in Washington. That was bad for jobs. That was bad for growth. Canadians are proud now to have a Prime Minister who understands the importance of that relationship and who is defending Canada's interests proudly in Washington.
Member for Portage,
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister says that market access is important to the government, but it looks like lobbyist access to officials in Ottawa and Washington is more important than any access. In fact, Mr. Speaker, this Liberal government is doing everything they can to put barriers in the way of Canadian oil exports. While Liberals are putting barriers in the way, the U.S. is lifting bans on exports. Liberals are putting bans on exports. Why are the Liberals saying one thing and doing the absolute opposite and blocking the opportunity for Canadian oil to get to market, Mr. Speaker?
The Honourable President of the Treasury Board.
Mr. Speaker, market access for Canadian energy is important. Our government understands that. But for 10 years, we had a Conservative government that failed to actually get any market access for Canadian energy, any pipeline to Tidewater, no success there, because, Mr. Speaker, they failed to defend Canadian interests in Washington. They didn't have the relationships. They failed to work with Aboriginal and First Nations leaders in Canada. They did not meet the premiers to work together on this, and they called environmentalists eco-terrorists. Mr. Speaker, we are not going to repeat the follies of the previous government. We're going to get it done.
The Honourable Member for Portage, Lisgar.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the fact is, under our government, 1.25 million barrels per day more of oil is getting to market than before 2005. Mr. Speaker, while the Liberals are banning exports, putting roadblocks in the way of pipelines and introducing a carbon tax, the U.S. government is doing the exact opposite. They're building pipelines, they're lifting bans, and they are selling oil, and there's no carbon tax. Why is the Liberal government doing everything they can to make Canadian oil uncompetitive and destroying the Canadian oil industry?
The Honourable President of the Treasury Board.
Mr. Speaker, again, this has been an exceptional week for Canada-U.S. relations. The Conservatives in their bitterness are playing politics this week, when in fact Canadians are proud to have a government, a Prime Minister, and ministers who are defending their interests in Washington. The Conservatives should stop playing politics. They should unite with Canadians who are proud of our Prime Minister this week, who's doing such an exceptional job defending Canadian interests and values in Washington.
Honorable député Lévis-Lobinière.
Monsieur le Président, nous avons affaire avec un Premier ministre qui n'a jamais eu à travailler fort pour boucler ses fins de mois comme des millions de Canadiennes et Canadiens. Alors qu'il nous promettait de stimuler l'économie, ce matin, le taux de chômage au Canada a augmenté et des milliers de Canadiennes et de Canadiens se cherchent du travail. Est-ce que ce gouvernement a autre chose à proposer que des hausses d'impôts pour stimuler l'emploi?
Honorable Président du Conseil du Trésor.
Monsieur le Président, on a hérité un déficit des conservateurs et on a hérité la croissance économique anémique. C'est pourquoi pour nous, c'est une priorité de faire les investissements dans la création des emplois et dans la création de la croissance économique. C'est exactement ce qu'on va faire dans le budget avec nos investissements dans l'infrastructure et dans la classe moyenne, Monsieur le Président. C'est exactement ce qu'on va faire.
Oui. Député de Lévis-Lobinière.
Monsieur le Président, ce gouvernement est incapable de trouver des solutions pour créer des emplois. Rien pour les petites entreprises, rien pour les investissements dans le secteur privé, rien pour le bois d'œuvre, rien pour la construction de pipelines, rien pour le secteur de l'agriculture, rien pour l'aérospatial, rien pour les ressources naturelles, rien pour créer des emplois dans le secteur manufacturier pour les Canadiens. Monsieur le Président, nous avons affaire avec un gouvernement qui est plus occupé à parader qu'à travailler. Y a-t-il un capitaine dans ce Titanic libéral?
Honorable président du Conseil du Trésor.
Monsieur le Président, mon collègue devrait attendre le budget parce qu'il va être heureux avec nos investissements dans l'infrastructure et dans la croissance économique et dans la classe moyenne. C'est la priorité de notre gouvernement de faire les investissements stratégiques pour la création de la croissance économique et ce sera une bonne chose pour la classe moyenne et pour tous les Canadiens.
Oui.
Honorable député d'Hochelaga.
Monsieur le Président, en campagne électorale, le Parti libéral s'est engagé à investir 2,6 milliards d'argent neuf pour l'éducation des Premières Nations. Cet investissement tenait compte de l'argent déjà prévu par l'ancien gouvernement conservateur. Mais on apprend aujourd'hui qu'en fait, les tiroirs sont vides, que le 1,25 milliard de dollars des conservateurs n'était que virtuel. Est-ce que le gouvernement s'engage à réinvestir le manque à gagner pour vraiment aider la jeunesse des Premières Nations?
Honourable Minister of Indigenous and Northern Affairs.
Speaker, it is extraordinarily important that we invest properly in the education of First Nations children and to close that gap in their education outcomes, which lead to health outcomes and economic outcomes. Sadly, I can confirm that the previous government removed the promised additional funding for First Nations education that they had promised, and which the previous minister confirmed in this House, in Committee of the Whole, that the money was still there in the fiscal framework. I am saddened by that revelation, but we are committed to make the appropriate investments to close that gap.
Honorable député d'Hochelaga.
Monsieur le Président, on parle d'enfants et de jeunes dans le besoin ici. On parle de communautés où on retrouve les plus hauts taux de décrochage scolaire. Des communautés qui ont besoin d'espoir, à qui le premier ministre a lui-même promis une nouvelle ère de relations nation à nation. Est-ce que le gouvernement va rejouer le même vieux film et encore laisser tomber les Premières Nations? Moi, je veux savoir, est-ce qu'ils vont vraiment faire quelque chose? Est-ce qu'ils vont vraiment réinvestir l'argent promis?
Honourable Minister of Indigenous and Northern Affairs.
Absolument. Je remercie le député pour sa bonne question. Nous allons travailler de nation à nation, en partenariat, un vrai partenariat, pour aider les Premières Nations à atteindre les buts qu'elles se sont fixés et soutenir les initiatives qu'elles pilotent. Le gouvernement, le sous-financement chronique du système d'éducation des Premières Nations a ralenti les étudiants des Premières Nations. L'amélioration des conditions sociales et économiques reste dans les propres investissements sur l'éducation.
Honourable member for Skeena Bulkley Valley.
Blaming the previous Conservative government for their failure doesn't help First Nations children out now. This morning, I dropped my children off at school. The school wasn't falling apart with mold, the textbooks weren't disintegrating, but that's not true for too many First Nations children that go to school on reserve. Simply saying that it's the last government's fault when the Liberals made a sacred commitment to fix the gap, to fund $2.6 billion into education. So this question is simple. This is yes or no. Will the Liberal government, not the one that campaigned, will the Liberal government follow through on this sacred commitment and promise and deliver the $2.6 billion to fix the gap?
The Honourable Minister of Indigenous and Northern Affairs.
Although we're saddened by the revelation of the previous government, taking the money that had been promised for First Nations education, we redouble our efforts to actually close this gap. I couldn't agree more with the member in terms of the shocking situation in First Nations schools across this country and the unacceptable level of post-secondary attainment. We are going to fix this problem, and I ask for the member's help in this challenge.
The honourable member for Skeena-Boltley Valley.
Sure, we'll get all the help she needs from New Democrats. $2.6 billion is what will fix the gap. Liberals also promised during the last election for electoral reform. Consultations and implementation will take time, yet the government has had 5 months with little to show for it. We've asked the minister to see and appreciate the urgency of now. New Democrats have proposed that we strike a citizens' working group to identify the problems we're trying to fix and establish the principles of a new voting system. Our antiquated first-past-the-post system was made by politicians for politicians. We must do better. Will the Democratic Reform Minister consider our proposal and engage Canadian society?
The Honourable Minister of Democratic Institutions.
Mr. Speaker, it is refreshing to see the New Democrats express interest in wanting to hear from Canadians on this important issue. Our government has already committed to striking a special committee as part of our platform commitment, and I would add that the honourable member and all members of this House, as well as all Canadians, are welcome to share their ideas with the committee as we engage in this very important national dialogue.
The honourable member for Haldeman Norfolk.
Mr. Speaker, everyone knows but the Liberals that you can't spend your way out of debt. The latest estimates are that the Liberal budgets will inflict $150 billion of new debt on Canadians without creating economic growth. Mr. Speaker, when will the Liberal government wake up and start managing the public purse responsibly so that our children and grandchildren will not be buried under a mountain of Liberal debt?
Yeah.
Honorable secrétaire parlementaire des Finances.
Monsieur le Président, après 10 ans de croissance économique anémique, nous avons fait un choix différent, Monsieur le Président. Nous avons fait le choix de la croissance économique. C'est exactement ce que nous allons faire. Monsieur le Président, quand nous avons fait nos consultations prébudgétaires de Moncton à Yellowknife, les Canadiennes et les Canadiens nous ont dit « investissez dans l'économie ». Les Canadiens savent que quand les taux d'intérêt sont bas, c'est le temps d'investir. Monsieur le Président, nous allons investir en innovation, nous allons investir dans la productivité, nous allons investir dans les infrastructures, nous allons investir dans les Canadiens, Monsieur le Président. Merci.
The honourable member for Haldeman Norfolk.
Well, Mr. Speaker, Sir John Templeton perhaps said it best in response to that when he said the four most expensive words are, "This time it's different." Canadians cannot afford this Liberal government's out-of-control borrowing and spending plan. When will the Minister of Finance start showing some fiscal sense and stop the reckless spending? Mr. Speaker, will he ever deliver a balanced budget for all Canadians?
Honorable secrétaire parlementaire.
Monsieur le Président, notre objectif, c'est l'équilibre budgétaire. Mais notre priorité, Monsieur le Président, c'est la croissance économique. J'inviterai mon honorable collègue à lire les économistes, à lire ce que le CDE a dit, à lire ce que le Fonds monétaire a dit. Monsieur le Président, tout le monde dit que c'est le moment d'investir dans l'économie pour faire de la croissance économique. C'est pour ça que nous allons continuer, Monsieur le Président, avec un plan historique pour les infrastructures. C'est pourquoi, dans le prochain budget, nous allons investir dans les Canadiens et les Canadiennes, dans la classe moyenne. C'est comme ça qu'on va faire croître l'économie, Monsieur le Président. C'est ce que les Canadiens et les Canadiennes ont choisi et c'est ce que nous allons livrer, Monsieur le Président.
The honourable member for Caribou, Prince George.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister and President announced yesterday that the softwood lumber irritant would get resolved in some fashion. Some fashion is not very reassuring, Mr. Speaker. This irritant supports approximately 145,000 well-paying quality jobs in BC alone. How am I supposed to tell my constituents they may not be able to put food on the table because this government considers the issue more of an irritant and does not consider a new softwood agreement a priority?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary for International Trade.
Mr. Speaker, the softwood lumber question has been an absolute priority for this government since day one. The Prime Minister has met with the President on a number of occasions, beginning in Manila and obviously this week. We have on the table a commitment, a public commitment from the President to table a joint report within 100 days, Mr. Speaker, that will set out the framework for an accord. That's an important announcement. Mr. Speaker, the Premier of British Columbia, Madam Christy Clark, qualified the news as fantastic.
The honourable member for Cariboo, Prince George.
Well, the Honourable Christy Clark considered the news fantastic, but she also said we need an agreement now, not in 100 days. There are 145,000 well-paying, high-quality forestry jobs in BC alone. Mr. Speaker, these jobs are all on the line. This Prime Minister is more interested in dining tables than negotiating tables. Will the Minister stand in the House and commit to ensuring that the interests of all Canadian forestry producers, large and small, will be protected in their negotiations?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the honourable member for his question. We have been well aware of the complexity of this file from the get-go. We have spoken to industry representatives across this country, large and small. We have spoken to our various partners at the provincial and territorial government level, Mr. Speaker. We are working hard on this file, and yes, we will arrive at a solution that will be good for all Canadians.
The honourable member for Kamloops, Thompson, Cariboo.
Mr. Speaker, the Justice Minister has failed to reassure Canadians. She refused to state whether the Liberals will protect private property from declaration of Aboriginal title. Both the Justice Minister, the Indigenous Affairs Minister say you're negotiating, they're settling, they're working nation to nation. Where does that leave the private landowner? Where does he fit into this equation? Does that mean that they're not at the table, they don't matter? Could she please stand up and say private property does matter?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Justice.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. As I indicated yesterday, the matter that gives rise to the honourable member's question is currently before the courts in British Columbia. It would be highly inappropriate to comment on a court case and the issues arising from the court case here on the floor of the House of Commons. The matters pertaining to that litigation belong before the court. What I can tell the honourable member is that the Minister of Justice is currently reviewing the overall litigation strategy of the government to ensure that at all times it's consistent with our commitment to Canadians, to our values, and to the Charter of Rights and Freedoms.
The honourable member for Kamloops, Thompson, Cariboo.
A Liberal government of the past was always willing to say private property is not on the table, and that was a value of Canadians. The Minister of Justice stated that she might be changing their approach when it comes to declaring Aboriginal title over private property. The BC Premier has firmly shut the door. Again, I will ask them, yes, it's before the courts, but can they stand up and they say they will protect private property rights?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, the Government of Canada is named as a defendant in this lawsuit. What they are going to say about the lawsuit will be said in court, not on the floor of the House of Commons. The positions taken by the government in court will be consistent with our commitment to Canadians, with our values, and with the Charter of Rights and Freedoms.
The member for Nanaimo, Ladysmith.
The Prime Minister made campaign promises about marijuana reform. But now courts are buzzing with confusion, and the Liberals are doing nothing to clear the air. They're spending over $4 million a year prosecuting people for simple possession. 22,000 people in 2014 alone. And hours of court time wasted on something that should not even be a criminal offence. So, Mr. Speaker, when will the Liberal government fulfill its promise to make simple possession of marijuana legal?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the honourable member for her question and the opportunity to clarify. Yesterday, the Director of Public Prosecutions indicated of the 1,136 judges in Canada, one had expressed confusion and concern about the law. This matter has been very clear, and this government has been very clear. We are resolved to legalise, regulate and restrict marijuana, and that work has begun. And in the interim, the law of this land is still in effect. And therefore, I would remind the member and all Canadians that the rule of law remains in effect. The law should be obeyed. The law should be upheld.
Honorable député de Rimouski-Neigette and Esquoit-Les-Basses.
Monsieur le Président, dans le dossier de la marijuana, le gouvernement ne cesse d'improviser et plus personne ne sait sur quel pied danser. Après les policiers, voilà le tour des juges. Ils se demandent pourquoi on porte encore des accusations pour une possession de marijuana à des fins personnelles si le gouvernement a l'intention de légaliser. Le gouvernement doit cesser de dire une chose et faire son contraire. Malheureusement, les réponses du secrétaire parlementaire ne font qu'ajouter de la confusion. Qu'est-ce que les libéraux attendent pour agir et décriminaliser la possession simple de marijuana?
Secrétaire parlementaire de la ministre de Justice.
Mr. Speaker, the government has been very clear that we are going to replace the criminal sanction with an effective and strong regulatory framework that will achieve our purposes of protecting our kids, making our communities safer, and taking the profits of this crime away from criminals. Decriminalization has been described by the Centre of Addiction and Mental Health as a half measure that does nothing to protect our kids, nothing to make our communities safer. And the experience of other jurisdictions has made it very clear. The implementation of half measures undermine and make ineffective our efforts to introduce stronger, effective regulations, and therefore we will do this job right and take the time to do it right.
L'honorable député de Communes, Jacques Cartier.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Dans un rapport de l'Institut de la statistique du Québec, nous apprenions que plusieurs régions se vident au détriment des grands centres. Nos régions sont importantes, les gens qui y habitent également. Il faut mettre des outils en place pour aider les petites et moyennes entreprises à développer et à prospérer. Pourquoi? Pour que nos régions créent des jobs et soient plus attrayantes pour la population, il faut les soutenir. Qu'entend faire le ministre de l'Innovation, de la Science et du Développement économique pour que les régions du Québec se sentent enfin considérées par ce gouvernement?
L'honorable secrétaire parlementaire du développement économique.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. Certainement, nos agences régionales économiques, de développement économique sont très importantes pour notre gouvernement et notre plan pour l'innovation. Ils font partie de notre plan pour s'assurer qu'on va créer des jobs dans toutes les régions du Canada, des jobs qui ont de la valeur, qui sont dirigés envers les exportations et qui sont basés sur l'innovation. Et c'est la raison pour laquelle je pense que tous les membres dans la Chambre des communes ici vont démontrer leur appui pour nos agences régionaux économiques. Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Honorable député de Portneuf, Jacques Cartier.
Monsieur le Président, les entrepreneurs sont inquiets quant au contenu du budget qui sera déposé le 22 mars prochain. La Fédération canadienne de l'entreprise indépendante doute de la volonté de ce gouvernement de mettre des mesures d'allègement fiscal en place pour donner de l'air à nos entreprises. Le meilleur moyen de développer de la richesse et de créer des emplois est d'arrêter d'étouffer nos entreprises. Le gouvernement peut-il reculer sur son intention de faire payer les entrepreneurs pour financer leur déficit astronomique?
Honorable secrétaire parlementaire.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank the honourable member for his question. This government understands the importance of small and medium-sized businesses. We understand that they represent over 90% of the businesses in this country and contribute over 40% of the GDP. That's why we're proud to deliver on our platform of reducing taxes for small businesses. As my minister said earlier in the week, watch for the budget. You'll see the details there. Thank you.
The honourable member for Halberton Court Lakes, Brock.
Mr. Speaker, Liberalnomics has ruined the economy of Ontario, and now it looks like Canada is on the exact same path. Today's release of the jobless numbers show last month's unemployment rate was the highest it has been in almost 3 years. Healthcare lost 20,000 jobs, education 17,000, and 9,000 jobs in natural resources. The Liberal plan, more red tape to delay job-creating projects. Mr. Speaker, when will the government get out of the way of private sector growth and let Canadians get back to work?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary for Finance.
Mr. Speaker, that's exactly why Canadians chose a different path on the 19th of October. Mr. Speaker, Canadians chose the path of growth, and that's exactly what the Minister of Finance and I heard when we went across the country. Mr. Speaker, now is the time to invest in the economy. Now is the time to invest in innovation, invest in productivity, invest in our infrastructure. Mr. Speaker, after 10 years of bad economic growth that these guys have left us, Canadians want us to work for them, and that's exactly what we're going to be doing.
Bravo, bravo. The honourable member for Souris Moose Mountain.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Road bans are on in southeast Saskatchewan. Anyone who still has a job in the oil industry is now out of work, adding to the thousands who are already permanently unemployed, and EI is starting to run out. In fact, 7,800 jobs losses happened last month alone in Saskatchewan. while the Liberals hobnob with the anti-energy activists and agree to study more studies, we know that this does not put food on the table for these families. When is the government going to take concrete steps to support those in Saskatchewan who are suffering from job losses today?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary for Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the question from my honourable member. As we've said many times in this House, we feel for the families, the communities in our energy-producing provinces who are going through this downturn in commodity prices. What we are doing, Mr. Speaker, is we are working to grow the economy. The National Energy Board, with its 5 new principles, is reviewing major projects. And as we modernize the NEB, we will have an opportunity to see projects go through a robust process that Canadians can have confidence in. Thank you.
The honourable member for Windsor-Tecumseh.
People in Tecumseh and throughout southwestern Ontario are worried about the impact of the TPP. This conservative trade deal will destroy tens of thousands of good jobs and severely damage Canada's auto sector. And yet the Liberals are pushing ahead without proper study and without consulting. Will the Trade Minister come to my community and look auto workers in the face before she rubber stamps a trade deal that sacrifices their jobs?
Very good. The Secretary for International Trade.
Mr. Speaker, our position on the TPP has remained consistent throughout our term in governance, and indeed stems from the election. We are studying the TPP. We are consulting across the country. We are consulting through the ministry. The minister's consulting. I'm consulting. The Trade Committee is going to begin going across the country and hearing Canadians on the TPP. And Mr. Speaker, the Minister of International Trade went to a Ford plant in Oakville and spoke to Ford workers on the shop floor about the TPP.
La députée de Salaberry-sur-Roi.
Monsieur le Président, le Catherine Spirit gît dans le lac Saint-Louis depuis 2011. J'ai récemment appris qu'il n'était surveillé qu'une fois par semaine et par hélicoptère. Contrairement à ce que dit le ministre, aucun inspecteur de la garde côtière n'a mis les pieds sur l'épave pour vérifier l'état depuis le mois de janvier, malgré les risques de vandalisme et le dégel. Est-ce que le ministre croit réellement que du haut d'un hélicoptère et une fois par semaine, on peut surveiller si des polluants s'échappent du bateau ou s'il y a eu des méfaits graves? Et comment le ministre peut-il affirmer que tout est sous contrôle s'il n'y a personne qui s'est rendu sur place?
Parlementaire du ministre des Pêches.
Monsieur le Président, le ministre était très proactif dans le dossier du Catherine Spirit. Enfin, en février, la Garde côtière canadienne a mis sur pied un groupe de travail avec Transport Canada et d'autres partenaires provinciaux, municipaux et du secteur privé afin de discuter de la situation relative au Catherine Spirit et trouver des solutions optimales. La première relation du groupe de travail, Monsieur le Président, a eu lieu le 7 mars. Les discussions se sont déroulées de manière très libre et très constructive. Et je peux dire, Monsieur le Président, que tous les experts se sont engagés à explorer toutes les alternatives possibles pour parvenir à trouver une solution permanente et sécuritaire. Et même le maire de Beauharnois, Monsieur le Président, a dit ceci: je considère l'ouverture du gouvernement comme étant une première et un très grand pas en avant.
Honorable député de Louis-Hébert.
Monsieur le Président, le Premier ministre et le ministre de la Sécurité publique en sont venus hier à une entente avec les Américains pour rendre notre frontière plus ouverte et plus sécuritaire. Après une décennie où les relations avec notre allié le plus important et notre plus gros partenaire commercial ont été endommagées, on voit déjà les bienfaits d'une relation plus positive et amicale. Et plus spécifiquement dans le dossier de l'aéroport international Jean-Lesage, que j'ai l'honneur d'avoir dans mon comté, on observe que ce gouvernement a fait plus en 5 mois que le gouvernement précédent en 10 ans. Le secrétaire parlementaire peut-il nous informer de l'entente en termes de dédouanement et de son impact sur l'aéroport international Jean-Lesage? Merci beaucoup.
Honorable secrétaire parlementaire de la Sécurité publique.
Monsieur le Président, de bonnes nouvelles pour le Canada ont été annoncées hier à Washington. En effet, nous avons conclu une entente de principe qui étendra le prédédouanement à plusieurs nouveaux sites. Je vous donne quelques exemples: la gare centrale de Montréal, la gare Rocky Mountaineer à Vancouver et notamment l'aéroport de Jean-Lesage, qui fait partie de la circonscription de mon collègue de Louis-Hébert. Donc, cette entente facilite la circulation des passagers et des marchandises tout en améliorant la sécurité à la frontière. C'est ça le résultat de négociations avec le meilleur partenaire à Washington.
Honorable député de Beauport-Limoilou.
Monsieur le Président, hier, le ministre ne s'est pas présenté tel que prévu au comité des anciens combattants. De plus, le ministre se moque des vétérans en ne répondant à aucune des questions d'opposition. Suivant la fin de la mission d'Afghanistan en 2014, nous avons prévu la construction d'un monument commémoratif pour honorer nos 40 000 vétérans qui y ont servi. Au lieu de désinformer les Canadiens, Monsieur le Président, est-ce que le ministre peut-il répondre aujourd'hui si oui ou non ce monument sera édifié? Merci, Monsieur le Président.
The Minister of Veterans Affairs.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I can inform the member that it is in Veterans Affairs bailiwick to respect and honor those men and women who have served in our armed forces, and in particular those who took part in the Afghan mission. It was very important to this country, their service and their sacrifice, and we will dutifully go about doing that. We are currently working with Canadian Heritage to find a way to get this project done, and I can tell the member that it will be moving forward in due process in a respectful and dignified manner.
The honourable member for Yorkton Melville.
Mr. Speaker, the mandate of Veterans Affairs Canada includes keeping alive the achievements and sacrifices of those who served Canada in times of war and peace. The Liberal decision to cancel the Community War Memorial Program is contrary to the Department's affirmation that there's a continued need for this essential program. Cancelling this program was not even brought up for discussion at their Veterans Stakeholder meeting. Why did the Minister make this decision without consultation, without openness and transparency with our veterans?
The Honourable Minister of Veterans Affairs.
My apologies, sir, as I would like to take this opportunity to talk about what we're doing in the Veterans Affairs Department. We're working very hard to ensure that our veterans are getting the care, compassion, and respect that they deserve. We're finding ways to find them more employment opportunities, more opportunities to go back to school, and having the ability to better their lives for their family as well as themselves. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Colleagues, of course, it's always helpful for those answering questions to address the topic raised, if at all possible. The member for Selkirk, Interlake, Eastman.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday American Deputy Secretary of Defense Robert Work was understandably anxious about Canada's decision to replace our CF-18 fighter jets. He noted that the United States is keen to hear Canada's decision since it could affect F-35 prices and our interoperability with our allies. Instead of having a fair and open process, the Prime Minister has set up a secret cabinet committee where they can politically rig the entire requirements. When will the Prime Minister stop playing politics and purchase the best fighter jet to replace our CF-18s?
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of National Defence.
Mr. Speaker, this government is committed to an open and transparent process to replace the CF-18 fighter. Regrettably, the previous government left behind a procurement process that is so Byzantine as to defy anyone trying to get major procurements through. As a consequence, the only procurement that was obtained in the last 10 years was a photo op with the previous minister on a plywood F-35, along with the leader of the opposition. So, Mr. Speaker, we intend to get this.
L'honorable député de Charlebourg, Haute-Saint-Charles.
Monsieur le Président, le secrétaire d'État américain adjoint à la Défense, Robert Work, demande au gouvernement canadien de se brancher et de décider quel avion remplacera les CF-18. Il souligne que le choix d'un avion doit être fait dans l'intérêt national des Canadiens, mais que les Américains sont anxieux de le savoir. Nous avons participé au développement et notre retrait aura un impact financier majeur sur les autres partenaires. Au-delà des soupers et des photos à Washington, est-ce que ce gouvernement va finalement se brancher et nous dire quel avion va remplacer les CF-18?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of National
As
Defence.
I previously said, Mr. Speaker, this government is committed to an open and transparent process. The procurement process that left behind is Byzantine in its nature. Regrettably, we are in a situation where we have to make a decision, and that decision will be made soon. The process was so complicated that, in fact, the Prime Minister felt compelled to create a special committee just to straighten out the process. So, Mr. Speaker, to get a question about procurement from that particular party is a little rich. Thank you.
Honorable député de Trois-Rivières.
Monsieur le Président, lors de la campagne électorale, le premier ministre est venu en Mauricie et a promis d'investir l'argent nécessaire pour venir en aide aux victimes de la pyrotite. Il a reconnu qu'il s'agissait d'un drame humain et d'un drame économique. Mes concitoyens attendent désespérément cette aide et dans l'attente, plusieurs doivent redonner les clés de leur maison à leur institution financière. Monsieur le Président, le budget sera présenté dans 11 jours et ma question est fort simple. Le premier ministre va-t-il respecter sa parole et aider financièrement les victimes de la pyrotite à cette occasion?
L'honorable secrétaire parlementaire des Finances.
Monsieur le Président, je voudrais remercier mon honorable collègue pour sa question. C'est un enjeu très important chez nous en Mauricie. Monsieur le Président, lorsque le premier ministre du Canada est venu chez nous en Mauricie, il a reconnu que les victimes, c'était un drame humain et financier pour les gens qui sont aux prises avec la pyrotite. Monsieur le Président, depuis le 19 octobre, à chaque jour, je m'affaire pour faire avancer ce dossier-là pour les gens de notre communauté. C'est une priorité et, Monsieur le Président, je suis fier de voir que notre premier ministre est venu en Mauricie pour justement parler aux victimes et leur dire comment lui voyait que le gouvernement canadien pouvait les aider. Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Honourable member for Saskatoon West.
Mr. Speaker, the UN is warning of a housing crisis affecting communities across Canada, a crisis that has been ignored for far too long. In fact, the last Liberal government slashed social housing. And now we see the government of Saskatchewan putting homeless people on a bus to BC. Does the minister agree with the NDP that buying a one-way ticket is not a solution? And will he commit to a social housing strategy that ends homelessness in communities across Canada?
Minister of Social Development.
Monsieur le Président. Je remercie aussi le député de l'autre côté de sa question, qui touche effectivement un point central du programme que nous avons développé et défendu durant la campagne électorale. Nous avons annoncé durant la campagne que le gouvernement canadien allait se réengager dans le dossier du logement abordable et social. Et nous avons beaucoup hâte, au cours des prochaines semaines, de continuer le processus que nous avons déjà entrepris auprès des provinces et des territoires pour faire en sorte que cet engagement se réalise concrètement et efficacement.
Honourable member for Calgary Rocky Ridge.
Mr. Speaker, this Liberal government needs to have more respect for Canadians and more respect for democracy. Recent polling shows us that 2/3 of Canadians expect a referendum if the government wants to change the way MPs are elected. Canadians want a referendum, and they deserve one. The government can show that it respects both Canadians and democracy by holding a referendum on their plans to change the voting system. Why does this government have such a problem with democracy that they are denying Canadians the final say on changes to their electoral system in a referendum?
Honourable Minister of Democratic Institutions.
Mr. Speaker, it is out of a great deal of respect for Canadians and for the democratic institutions we are so privileged to have that this government committed to bringing our electoral system into the 21st century. It is out of that respect for Canadians that we have committed to establishing a parliamentary committee to engage Canadians in this very important conversation. And it is out of respect for the next generation that we will do our best to enhance the existing systems and lead the world in terms of democratic strength and democratic institutions.
The honourable member for Central Okanagan, Similkameen Nicola.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The minister seems to talk a good game, but again, she continually says to this House that it is both too soon to decide whether to hold a referendum on changing the voting system, and also that it would be a huge disservice to democracy to have one. Those are her own words. I think most Canadians would disagree with that, Minister. In my province, a citizens' assembly proposed changing the voting system, and the provincial government put these changes to the people, British Columbians, not once but twice. Canadians deserve the final say if the Liberal government wants to change how Canadians vote. Why won't the government give the people a say?
The Honourable Minister of Democratic Institutions.
Mr. Speaker, I have missed this line of questioning, I must admit. Mr. Speaker, it is entirely within... Mr. Speaker, we have committed to listening to Canadians. I have stood time and time again in this House expressing a willingness to work with all members of this House. I encourage all of you to engage in this important conversation. We will establish a parliamentary committee made up of members of this House to engage Canadians from coast to coast to coast.
I assure the Honourable Minister that all of me is listening. But we don't use the word you here, of course, unless we're referring to the Speaker. The Honourable Member for Barrie, Springwater, Oro-Medonte.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Liberals like to give perks to party donors. Lobbyists and Liberal bagmen have gotten the perk of a state dinner. Working Canadians aren't so fortunate. While bagmen and Liberal lobbyists get to sit at the big table, we Canadians are left here with the $30 billion bill. When will Liberals start helping all Canadians rather than just those who fatten their coffers and fill their trough?
The Honourable President of the Treasury Board.
Mr. Speaker, all Canadians benefit from what happened in Washington this week, from having a Prime Minister and a government that can stand face to face and shoulder to shoulder with the President of the United States to move our nations forward and to defend Canadian interests. All Canadians understand the importance of Canada-U.S. relations. They finally have a Prime Minister who understands the importance of that relationship.
The Honourable Member for Cambridge.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Canada is the world's 7th largest beef exporter and the 2nd largest exporter of grain-fed beef. Beef exports are valued at $2.2 billion, which demonstrates this industry's importance to our economy and to Canadian jobs. There are close to 1,000 beef farmers in Waterloo Region, including Oak Ridge Acres in my riding of Cambridge and North Dumfries. Can the Minister of Agriculture update the House on what this government is doing to help beef farmers and to help the beef industry? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Minister of Agriculture.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank my honourable colleague from Cambridge for his question and concern. I can assure him the Canadian cattle industry is a major driver of our economy, worth $10 billion. This week, I was proud to announce an investment of $4 million to the Canadian Cattlemen Association for 3 initiative projects to support the industry with new and existing markets. Our government's focus on investing in research, innovation and markets will help keep Canadian 68,000 beef farmers on the cutting edge. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Member for Sarnia-Lambton.
Well, the Prime Minister is using official government business in Washington to raise money for the Liberal Party. There's a serious international matter involving Canadians abroad that demands his attention. John Ridsdale and Robert Hall are 2 Canadians who've been held hostage in the Philippines by the terrorist group Abu Sayyaf. Yesterday, a video emerged of the 2 of them being threatened with their lives, and in the video, both men specifically asked this government to act. Can the Minister of Foreign Affairs tell this House what the Canadian government is actually doing to help free these men from their terrorist captors?
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary for Foreign Affairs, Consular Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Government of Canada is aware of the video that has been released. Our priority is the safety of our citizens, and that's precisely why we will not comment on anything that this government is doing right now, because our priority is the safety of Canadians, but we are on top of that file.
The Honourable Member for Kitchener South, Hespeler.
Mr. Speaker, during the campaign, we committed to science-based policy decisions. To be able to do this, we need to also encourage scientific research ourselves and ensure that those important projects receive the funding they require. Can the Minister of Science update the House on the government's recent announcement regarding space health research?
Minister of Science.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank my honourable colleague for the question. Earlier this week, the Minister of Innovation, Science, Economic Development and I announced an investment of $1.7 million to fund 4 Canadian studies to reduce the risks of Canadians on long-term missions. The scientific mission will deepen our knowledge of the effects of longer missions and improve our understanding of the effects of prolonged isolation and physical inactivity. We commit to encourage scientific research, and we are delivering.
Hear, hear. Hear, hear. The Honourable Member for Carleton.
Mr. Speaker, according to the Canadian National Institute for the Blind, about 1/3 of those suffering with visual impairment discontinue their studies for that reason. One of the problems is the absence of books in Braille and audio format. The good news is that there are about a quarter million such books produced in 13 countries around the world that could be accessible to Canadians if we would change our copyright laws and let them in. The previous government introduced legislation to do just that in the last Parliament, last April, and I wonder if the government would rise and introduce that legislation for quick passage.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary for Economic Development.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank the honourable member for that question. We support the Marrakesh Treaty, Mr. Speaker. Many Canadians live with a disability that doesn't allow them to access printed material and find it also that they need to participate. If they're going to access this material, they need to participate in our economy. And so this government is working to address this challenge by facilitating persons with print disability to have works or access to works in large print in different formats to provide overall greater accessibility to these works, Mr. Speaker. And we're hoping that all members will continue to support the adoption of this law.
L'honorable député de Joliette.
Monsieur le Président, en vertu du système de la gestion de l'offre que le gouvernement s'est engagé à protéger, le lait consommé chez nous doit être produit chez nous. D'ailleurs, il y a quelques semaines, le ministre reconnaissait lui-même que les importations de protéines laitières posent problème. Or, malgré ses beaux discours, le ministre ne propose aucune solution pour remédier à ce grave problème qui fait souffrir nos producteurs laitiers québécois. Le ministre de l'Agriculture s'engage-t-il à resserrer rapidement une fois pour toutes le contrôle des importations et mettre en place des mesures de compensation pour les producteurs de lait?
The Honourable Minister of Agriculture.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate my honourable colleague's question and concern. And I can assure you that I've met many sectors in the agricultural industry, including the dairy farmer. Being a dairy farmer myself, I fully understand the problem, and we are discussing it with the industry, and we will come to a conclusion.
Honorable député de Repentigny.
Monsieur le Président, hier, au BAP, TransCanada a dévoilé un scénario catastrophe qui pourrait déverser 3,6 millions de litres de pétrole dans nos cours d'eau. Mais pire encore, c'est que la compagnie a prouvé qu'elle n'a aucune idée des impacts d'un déversement sur nos cours d'eau et donc que son plan d'urgence a été rédigé sur un coin de table. Le président du BAP a même souligné que TransCanada créait un réel malaise en étant incapable de répondre aux questions. Est-ce qu'en cette Chambre, on sera capable de répondre à ma question? Qu'est-ce que ça va prendre pour que le gouvernement reconnaisse que ce projet ne tient pas la route?
The Honourable Parliament Secretary for Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The health and safety of Canadians and protection of the environment remain at the Government of Canada's top priorities. The government is committed to regaining public trust by ensuring proposed projects such as new pipelines undergo credible, robust environmental and regulatory reviews. The Pipeline Safety Act will ensure that Canada maintains a high standard for its pipelines. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
L'honorable député de Pierre-Boucher, les Pétrades-Verchères.
Monsieur le Président, on vient d'apprendre que la FTQ a déposé une demande d'injonction à la Cour supérieure pour qu'Air Canada respecte la loi. 2 jugements ont déjà donné raison au gouvernement du Québec. Monsieur le Président, la loi est claire. Est-ce que le ministre des Transports va respecter la parole qu'il a donnée aux travailleurs d'Avios dans le passé?
Honorable ministre des Transports.
Je ne commenterai pas sur les processus judiciaires, mais je soulignerai le fait que la situation a beaucoup évolué dans les 4 dernières années. Comme on le sait, Air Canada a l'intention d'acheter 45, possiblement 75 avions bombardiers et de s'impliquer dans l'implantation d'un centre d'excellence qui verra l'entretien de ces avions pendant au moins 20 ans. Air Canada est aussi en train de parler avec le gouvernement du Manitoba. Alors voici une bonne situation où on est en train de créer des emplois de qualité pour les Canadiens dans le secteur aéronautique. Merci.